Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today I'm going to be talking about my first impressions from watching The War of the Rohirrim. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the librarian, and last night, opening night, I watched The War of the Rohirrim, and I've got a lot of thoughts about this, and I just want to give you my first impressions today, just kind of the first things I'm thinking about after having seen this film. Now, of course, we've been thinking about this film for a while now. We've known that it's coming for a couple of years, and we've had a few trailers and images released along the way. But now we have the full film and we can really look at it on its own merits. First off, I want to say this video is not going to be spoiler free, but I will give you my recommendation, and then if you don't want to be spoiled, you can go ahead and stop the video there. My recommendation for this movie is that it is a good movie. It did not seem like an incredible movie to me on this first viewing, but it was a good movie. And who is it a good movie for? Well, it's a good movie for Lord of the Rings fans who enjoy watching something that's animated. If that's not you, then this movie really isn't going to be for you and you shouldn't watch it. It is an anime film, so it is animated, but it is in the anime camp. Now, I don't watch a lot of anime, so I can't tell you what it's like from an anime perspective, whether or not it is good or bad anime, because I don't really have any lens for that. But as far as the Lord of the Rings film goes, I think it's a good film. It is a good story in Middle-earth, but you should not go into it expecting to see something of the quality of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, because that's not what it is. It's a completely different genre. So you should not go into this movie thinking that it's going to be the 7th Peter Jackson film, because it's not. In fact, as far as I can tell, I don't think Peter Jackson was very involved in it at all. He was just kind of tacked on as an executive producer later on. Philippa Boyens, yes, she was involved, although she wasn't the main writer on the film, from what I understand. But Peter Jackson, not really. They're just kind of doing that for marketing. So don't expect it to be the 7th Peter Jackson film. Don't expect it to be on that level. And remember, this is an adaptation of a really short story that Tolkien told in the appendices that was more written as a history. It's very light on actual detail. There's really only a couple of even lines of actual dialogue in the story. So there's a lot that has to be filled in along the way. Okay, that's it for spoiler free. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about what I think of the film with some specifics. So like I said, I enjoyed watching the movie. It's not my favorite Middle-earth movie that's ever come out, but I enjoyed it. Some people have gone out and said that the animation was amazing and they loved it. And some people have said the animation was really choppy and I hated it. I think this is more of a stylistic thing than anything else. Some people enjoy the style in which this film was cut and some people don't. There were definitely times where it got a little bit choppy for me, or I kind of lost it in the motion and the way that it was done. I thought it was beautifully done as far as like the colors and stuff go. For me, it was a little choppy, but again, I don't watch a lot of anime, so I don't know if that is an anime style thing or if that's just this was how this studio did this film thing. When a character is kind of far away or in the background, their face will not be very detailed at all. In fact, at points it almost looks like it's a smiley face. Again, I'm not sure if this is an anime thing or not. My really only connection with anime is Pokemon, and I do remember this type of thing happening in Pokemon shows and films. So it may just be an anime thing that when something is far away, they don't put a lot of detail into it. Now, I already knew that that was going to be the way it was because I'd watched the trailers for this movie and you could already see that in the trailer. So I didn't find that jarring, but I think some people did. One of the things that I really liked about this movie was it hit on all of the major points that Tolkien talked about in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. There isn't a lot there, and so of course there's tons of filling in that they have to do. A lot of the characters are new characters that they needed to devise themselves in order to flesh out the story and tell it on film. And that didn't bother me because they did such a good job of actually putting in the points that are in the book. Are there changes? Yes, of course there are changes. There's always going to be changes, and maybe I don't always agree with those changes, but I felt like the story was thoughtfully considered in its translation to film. One of the major changes was to make Hera the focus, and Hera is a made-up name. It's not in the story. Helm does have a daughter, and it is the kind of flashpoint in the story where Freka comes and asks for her to marry Wolf. So that is all part of the actual story that Tolkien told, but the daughter doesn't have a name, and besides that point, she doesn't play a major role in the story that Tolkien told. Now, it doesn't bother me that they fleshed out her character more, and I think they provided a route for this to be understood by having Éowyn tell the Frame story at the beginning and explain that you've probably never heard of her because she wasn't written into the history books. And I thought the character of Hera did a nice job in this story and gave us a nice perspective and lens to view the story from. going from characters who weren't fleshed out at all in the story to the main kind of portrayal in Tolkien's writings in the story, and that would be Helm. And I thought Helm, fantastic job. He looks like I think you'd expect him to look. He acts exactly the way he's supposed to act, and he does the things that he's supposed to do. So they really hit everything with Helm for me here in this story. There's a lot of other characters in this story, and some of them were good and some of them were bad. I thought Helm's sons, they did a nice job on. I could have maybe gotten a little bit more from them so that I was a little bit more emotionally attached when they each eventually die, but I felt like they still had good impact and they were doing mostly what they should have done. Hummer really should have died leading some troops out, and instead he kind of sacrifices himself at the back of their escape because his horse isn't fast enough. That was okay with me. Nothing too crazy there. Freylof, I liked his character. I thought he did a nice job. It was very much a mirror or a reflection of Eomer's character in the Lord of the Rings books, and so I thought that was kind of a nice nod back, and it gave him a good reason to not be at Helm's Deep when everyone else was, so that he could come in and save them at the end, which is a point that needed to be brought in from the book. Wolf, I found to be a really interesting character. Obviously, they built up some of the backstory around him a little bit, but he goes through this terrible experience of watching his father die, and that turns him into a really terrible person who is fixated on revenge. Now, there were some characters that I didn't love. One was the old crone who is in the Hornburg. She didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I didn't understand why she was there and what she was supposed to be doing or accomplishing as a character, and so I didn't really like that. The other one was Leaf, who is Hera's guard. I think he was put in there maybe to be comic relief because he has what are maybe supposed to be some funny moments, but really he didn't add much to the story, and I think in some points he kind of detracted from it. So either they needed to put more onto him so that we would be more invested in, or they could have just left him out, in my opinion. But overall, I think the characters were well devised, they were well drawn, and they were executed well by the actors who played them. While I'm talking about characters, I want to talk about one of the points of criticism that I've seen around this film, and that is that it is cliche fantasy, and a lot of the characters are just tropes. And I want to address that because while I think you could definitely look at this film and say that that is true in some respects, I don't know if it's a valid criticism. And let me explain why. I think if you look at something and say that's cliche fantasy, you need to understand that Tolkien's works are the pivotal point in fantasy. Basically, everything that comes afterwards is based on what Tolkien did. So if it seems cliche, it's because everybody's done it since Tolkien did it. And so what you're really doing is you're seeing the first instances of that. And so to have that be in an adaptation of Tolkien's work is totally valid. The other point is that these are just like reflections of characters that Tolkien made. So you can talk about this with Hera being very much like Éowyn in a lot of respects and being in the same place, Rohan, as Éowyn. You can talk about it with Freylof being very much like Éomer, like I just did. You could talk about it with Lord Thorn being a lot like Wormtongue and going through this betrayal thing with the King of Rohan. That's all true. And it's also exactly the kind of thing that Tolkien does. Tolkien reuses his storylines over and over and over again. He is constantly having things that reflect or mirror other things that he's done. He takes parts of one story and builds them into another story. A prime example of this is the Elven King in The Hobbit, who is almost an exact duplicate of Thingol in the Silmarillion. And so Tolkien always was doing this kind of thing. And so it's not weird at all to be like, oh, if you're adapting Tolkien, you would have a reflection of other of Tolkien's characters here. Makes a lot of sense. It's true that these kind of reflections can be done poorly and sometimes are. There's certainly moments like that in The Rings of Power, but it's still a valid way to tell Tolkien stories if you do it well. Okay, so I don't think there was anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking about this film. It's a kind of a middle of the road film in that respect. And I think that, like I said before, that's what you should expect going into it. The problem is, Warner Brothers did a huge disservice to this film by building it up and trying to attach it to the Peter Jackson films. The Peter Jackson films were epic. They were supposed to be epic. They were telling one of the greatest stories that has ever been told. And to try and expect this film to duplicate that is try to ask it to do something that it's not there to do. This film is based on about 2.5 pages of text. There's a lot that has to be built out, and it's just not that epic of a story. It's kind of a normal human story. So I put a lot of the blame for people who feel disappointed in this film on Warner Brothers for the way that they marketed this film and attaching Peter Jackson's name to it at all. I just don't think that was helpful. They thought that it would help to save the film. I think ultimately it harmed the film to do that, especially the way they cut those trailers together with parts of the Peter Jackson films and parts of this animated film. Just led people to expect the wrong thing. That being said, There are some things that I didn't like about this film. I've already talked a little bit about like the character of the old woman and Leaf. There are a few other things, and I think that these were problems that were probably kind of foisted on the film to make it attach more to the Lord of the Rings. One is going to be the orcs. The orcs scene just didn't make any sense. To have these orcs out there in the middle of Rohan, in the middle of winter, collecting rings. I think they were supposed to be like looting dead bodies, but that wasn't made completely clear. And it just didn't make sense at all. It was just like, oh, we needed some rings because this is a Lord of the Rings film. It didn't work for me. This is a human-centric story from the outset. There are no elves, there are no dwarves, there are no hobbits, and there are no orcs except for this one scene. And it just kind of jars you out of the story. Now, I didn't mind so much the snow troll because that was an interesting like way to say, well, maybe some of these people who are being torn apart aren't being torn apart by Helm. They're being torn apart by this snow troll, but you can't really tell the difference. And in the book, it's really unclear what was happening there when Helm was going out and killing people with his bare hands and whether or not he was going out unarmed and that kind of thing. And so having the snow troll there was okay, but it didn't make sense that he was with the orcs. And then the other part that I didn't like was related to this, and that was Hera heading out at the end to talk about what she saw with the orcs with Gandalf. It seemed like they just wanted to slap the name Gandalf into the film for the reason of connecting it back to the other films and the larger story, so people would be like, oh yeah, Gandalf, which I think I already have a bitter taste in my mouth around slapping Gandalf in places he's not supposed to be from the Rings of Power. That just didn't sit well with me at all. I didn't like that part of the end. I don't think it was needed, and I think everything could have ended just fine without it, and probably even better. On the flip side of that, I did not mind having Saruman appear at all at the end of the film, because that's literally in the story that Tolkien wrote, was that Saruman showed up there at that point. So that was perfectly fine. That was a good attachment point to the Lord of the Rings because it was supposed to be there and it wasn't just like made up. Of course, there is some ridiculous things that happen in this film because it is an action animated film, so there are points where the laws of physics just seem to be broken entirely. And it can look kind of ridiculous sometimes when a character like jumps off of a burning building or something and they fall like 3 stories and are perfectly fine. And one of the things that I would kind of put into the ridiculous camp would be that scene with the Mumakil, the elephant, and the Watcher in the water. I didn't like that at all. It seemed very gratuitous, calling back to the Lord of the Rings films, and there just didn't seem to be a lot of reason for it. I may have been able to take the Mumakil, but the Watcher in the water being there, not in a deep place, not near a deep place, not for any reason, and then to be particularly called out as a Watcher in the water, just to like use that name, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me, and I didn't really appreciate it. But for some people, it was probably a fun action scene that they enjoyed. So those are my initial thoughts. Overall, I'm feeling pretty positive about this film. I hope that it does well so that we can continue to get more Middle-earth adaptations. I want to see more of these stories kind of explored and told, as long as they're done in a thoughtful and meaningful way, which I think by and large they did do in this movie. And now I would love to hear from you. If you've seen more of the Rohirrim, go ahead, drop in the comments. Let me know what you thought of it. Let me know if you agree or disagree with some of my thoughts. Of course, always be respectful when we're talking about this, and be respectful of the creators who put their hard work and effort into trying to make something for us. Until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your Eries receive you at your journey's end.